Thank you both for agreeing to do this interview. And with my first question, I'm hoping it'll be a kind of question to get you to introduce yourselves a bit and situate the article that we're talking about. So you have both done a considerable amount of research and writing at the intersections of anti-colonial, critical race, and critical animal studies, including previous explorations of topics concerning food politics. So with that background in mind, I wonder if you could begin maybe by saying a bit about yourself and contextualizing your article From Wet Markets to Meatpacking, Why Animal Advocacy Fails Without Anti-Racism. What was the impetus to write this article and also to write it together?
Lauren, would you like to go ahead?
Sure, I'll start. My name is Lauren Corman. I'm an associate professor of sociology at Brock University. I was hired in 2009 to teach critical animal studies. So the project of my career and of my activism for about 20 years has been thinking about the intersections of different forms of oppression, and increasingly thinking about how issues of animal and human oppression are related to capitalism and colonialism. I teach in this area and I've been writing articles in this area. And sometimes I rant on social media about this as well. And so that's kind of what started this for this particular article for Darren and me, because I was frustrated looking at some of the coverage of the COVID pandemic and how animal advocates were latching on to this issue to raise awareness about global industrial agriculture and food systems. And I thought that while there was an excellent opportunity to shed light on some of the inequalities built into global food systems, that people were not including an anti-racist analysis in their coverage, in particular of the wet markets. And I saw that being inserted into the public dialogue, especially with people like Brian Adams, although that might have come after. Darren, you might have to correct me on that, but it was sort of right when all that stuff was going down. And so I wrote just a private, angry little tirade as an Instagram post, and then Darren saw it. So I'll turn it over to Darren about the next part of the story.
I'm Darren. I've been a long-time activist. I've spent most of my time in the animal advocacy movement, but I've also kind of through the animal advocacy movement branched out over the last 10 years to really learn about the importance of building coalitions and solidarities across movements, whether it's indigenous land and water defense or anti-capitalism and food justice, that kind of stuff. And I've also been a student in studying critical animal studies, and I did my master's at Queen's University in political philosophy, where my research explored human, non-human relations and solidarities in cities. And I mean, over the last 10 years, I've observed as an animal advocate how oftentimes it's white dominated and a lot of activists disproportionately sort of target, and just like the anger that they show toward non-Western animal practices is just so much more harsh compared to the kind of tone and relative civility they would express toward dominant animal practices like factory farming and other things here in our part of the world. And so that's something that I've known for a long time and continue to observe on the internet and across social media. And so this time around, when a lot of the blame was put on wet markets and particularly on East Asians and in the COVID crisis, it's just kind of like a recurrent theme. So when I saw Lauren's social media rant, I just thought like, wow, yeah, this is something that needs to be said. Like more people need to hear this, and we could potentially expand it into an entire article with a lot more analysis in there. So that's kind of how it happened.
I'll just quickly jump in and say that kind of the notion of animal-linked racialization is something that I think Darren and I have been thinking a lot about. This seemed like such a clear example of that animal-linked racialization where animal practices are used to racialize various groups and perpetuate racism.
Your article was published in late August, and since then we're having this interview in mid-December 2020, and the pandemic, of course, has continued and is escalating at the time that we're talking. So what's occurred in that time in terms of how responses to the pandemic unfolded that has made you want to expand on what you wrote over the summer?
So we alluded to this in our article about how the existing food system, that is animal-based food systems, particularly animal agriculture, has been really destructive to ecological communities and the habitats of other species of animals. And I think over the summer, towards the end of it, we saw massive fires across the west coast of the United States. And so I think that is definitely one area that I'd be really interested in expanding on. And I'm sure Lauren as well. Drawing a tighter connection between how habitat destruction increases the risk of pandemics. In this case, our food systems are directly responsible for producing. And I remember seeing this article during the fires, and it's about the Tule elk population in California. And this article is in the Los Angeles Times, and it does a really good job sort of talking about the history as well of how ranching and dairy farming was directly responsible for basically outcompeting and taking over habitat and land from the Tule elks, to a point where during the fires, we saw a lot of animal rights activists actually taking direct action to go into the reserves and the parks to basically, feed the elks, make sure they have water, and just reduce as much suffering as possible. So I think that is an important connection there. And I think since COVID and since all these natural disasters that we've seen over the past few years, the big fires in Australia and the Amazon rainforest, there's also just a lot more research done now that is explicitly talking about these kinds of connections between pandemics, ecological destruction, and resource extraction and stuff like that. And I think the other part too is, again, in the fires that we saw how a lot of farm workers that are working on produce farms growing vegetables and fruits were forced to, these are essential workers to making sure that the food supply is sustained, especially during a pandemic where people are afraid of food shortage and stuff like that. And we saw these farm workers working in the smoke and just a terrible situation. And it reminded me of how, even though our article focused on meat packing, and a lot of animal advocates have also pointed out how slaughterhouses and animal agriculture is responsible for zoonotic viruses and things like that, and is highly exploitative as well. At the same time, we need to extend our anti-racism and solidarity, so the kind of analysis that we've shared in our article, and extend that to farm workers that are producing plant-based foods. And this is kind of in alignment with the mission and the work that Food Empowerment Project is doing, who we cited in our article. So I think those are the two kind of areas that, given the events that have unfolded over the summer, we could definitely expand on.
I'll just briefly add that one of the things that I think that Darren and I are both interested in is thinking about food politics as animal politics. So some of the food justice work and work around food sovereignty is not inclusive of animal subjectivity or thinking about animals' experiences. And one of the things that I think the animal movements brings to a conversation about food politics is to think about the subjectivity of human and non-human beings. And one of the things that was exciting me about the possibility of expanding the article was the theoretical interventions that I think that we're wanting to explore further, which is how do we think about animal justice and food justice, and then contextualize them within a broader analysis of colonialism and capitalism. So that's something that I feel like over the past 10 years of witnessing critical animal studies grow, is that we're having richer conversations. There's more theoretical tools to talk about structural inequalities and talk about things like taxonomies of power, which Claire-Jean Kim centralizes in her text, Dangerous Crossing. So I think that COVID and the intersections between that and climate change and Black Lives Matter, that this is a moment to develop a language and a theoretical analysis that bridges some of the more philosophical and individualistic understandings of animal rights and brings them into a broader theoretical framework related to those trajectories of capitalism and colonialism. So that's part of the reason why, because I think it's an important site right now and an important historical moment, and that we can use some of those theoretical tools and develop them into these case studies to illuminate what's actually happening, and then perhaps even maybe ambitiously how we might intervene better within critical animal studies or the animal movements, or as Darren's talked so eloquently about, so building solidarities across movements and not doing the comparison work that I think the earlier animal movements and still today are drawing comparisons between different groups rather than thinking about structural inequalities and power. And so I think one of the things that we were concerned about in the article, and that we will be able to expand on in the academic piece, is that we're really talking about the intersections of different forms of structural power and then how that's enacted. And it's not about comparisons between different groups. And I really feel such indebtedness to the critical race scholars like Claire Jean Kim and others who have been doing work in this area that allow us to talk about those intersections without drawing comparisons between the groups, if that makes sense.
For sure. Thank you for those answers. At a certain point in the pandemic, we were seeing a lot of images in the news of meatpacking plants focusing on the dangerous conditions in which humans in the plants are working, so dangerous both for themselves and for the community, given the pandemic. Even if this wasn't the intention, these images provided some glimpses into the places and conditions in which animals live and die. Whereas with the ag gag laws, it's relatively rare for the public to see those sites, and people also don't want to see those sites, so they don't search out those images, but we were just seeing them every day on the news. So there's also a moment when in the US, some meatpacking employees called for a meat boycott. So I recall that at that time, there was some hope on the part of animal advocates that the terrible situation might raise awareness about the oppression of both animals and workers in these places that could result in a drop in meat consumption. But as your article discusses, the situation in fact drew racist responses such as the vilification of mostly Filipino meatpacking employees in Alberta. And a few months on, I'm not sure that those images and news stories have had a lasting impact on meat consumption or how people are thinking about food. So far from a drop in meat consumption during the pandemic, we saw the phenomenon of meat hoarding, and we heard that meat packing is an essential service, which of course reinforces the idea that animal products are essential foods for humans, when national food guides right now are finally coming around to acknowledging that meat, eggs, and dairy are not essential sources of protein, and in fact, we should be eating less of them. So what are your thoughts on this?
My answer for this is a little bit pessimistic. I mean, I have a lot of mixed feelings. So I think generally speaking, just about current outcomes and responses to the pandemic, almost, I think, yeah, over a year now after COVID first started spreading, I think when the pandemic was kind of finally begin to peak earlier in 2020, I think there were a lot of radical, more positive visions about how this pandemic has sort of exposed the failings of neoliberal capitalist political and social economic systems and institutions. And so there was these really hopeful moments where people thought that maybe we could finally move toward more caring and empathic societies grounded in, practices of mutual aid and care. And I think, to be fair, a lot of that did happen within kind of smaller local scales in neighborhoods, etc. But the overarching theme, I think, if we see what's happening today, it just seems like both the governments, the way that they've kind of reopened schools and businesses and things like that, it's just this kind of constant, still kind of complete lack of support. And it seems like we're really stuck and we can't move toward transformation. And yeah, I'm not surprised, I guess, is my answer, that we did not see a decrease in the consumption of animal products. And even throughout the year, I've seen, like animal advocates sort of talking about how meat consumption causes pandemics, and it's true, but very few animal advocates took the opportunity to also address the plight of slaughterhouse workers. And so that tension is still there. And I think there's a lot of unwillingness on the part of animal advocates to consider the positions and perspectives of slaughterhouse workers, and how, a lot of times within this really highly exploitative capitalist system, oftentimes when something gets described as an essential service, what they're really just saying is that, a lot of these workers are actually disposable, that that it's okay to sacrifice them because their work is important. But if we actually look at how they're being treated in terms of the working conditions and the wages that they're being paid and what kind of benefits they have or don't have, essential service is just this cover for justifying deeper and more violent forms of exploitation. I think it's positive that we're seeing national food guides kind of acknowledging that animal products are not essential and that we should be eating less of them. But overall, I think, again, this goes back to kind of what Lauren was talking about, and at a more theoretical level, I think it's important for people doing any kind of food justice, social justice work to adopt the framework of just being able to connect these issues better, because I think unless we have that, it's tough to address these things simultaneously and see how they're interconnected.
Yeah, I mean, this just always makes me so glad to hear you talk about these things, Darren, because it's just been so great to collaborate with you and to continue to collaborate on these issues. I guess I'll start off by saying that I feel that the animal movements have wagered a lot on visibility. One of the tropes that gets trotted out a lot is the idea of the slaughterhouses had glass walls, we'd all be vegetarians. And I mean, I think a lot of people have challenged this notion then, but we did see this kind of resurgence of optimism about visibility would translate to change. I think that's part of what you're getting at, perhaps, Chloe, with some of the visibility, that it was this opportunity to sort of look beyond the walls. And not to minimize that, I think that it did strike people that this is rare when we see inside slaughterhouses or hear very much about the conditions. I think that the animal movements and animal studies is starting to change, where there is an increasing willingness to engage with intersectionality and to begin to see these issues as connected: the treatment of animals, the treatment of workers, the treatment of the environment, all being objectified and exploited under capitalism and colonialism. But I think that those moments really easily sort of slip. They become something that's kind of ephemeral and we can't hang on to it. We have these moments. It almost reminds me of when we have an individual animal who escapes from a slaughterhouse, and then we have a kind of opportunity to think about the individuality of those animals, and then they fade back into the background. And I think that happened a little bit with this situation as well. Hopefully we continue to build momentum and use it as an opportunity to raise awareness about those conditions. But I think that Darren's right, that there is still a resistance within the animal movements, although I feel that it's changing, that workers are demonized and people really aren't doing that larger analysis, and they're not seeing how these issues are interconnected. And so workers are very easily seen as the perpetuators of abuse, rather than situating the treatment of animals within those contexts and the kinds of horrible conditions that workers are in within that broader analysis of economics. And that's something that I'm excited to see, that at least there's more anti-capitalist analyses that are making their way into the animal movements. But it can feel like quite glacial, the change, and especially given climate change, these sorts of issues feel that much more urgent to try to resolve. And I think certainly COVID showed us to the very abject state that workers can be exploited under capitalism. I couldn't believe that we were watching things get worse for slaughterhouse workers, who are one of the most exploited sets of laborers that there are. So I think that there's internal work within the animal movements that we need to do to raise awareness about intersectionality and to think about the interconnections of these ideas. I guess I'm a little bit less, maybe it's just today, but I'm a little bit less pessimistic than Darren is, because I feel like the animal movements, even in the backlash against intersectionality, that there's at least more room for these conversations. And I know the animal movements are still so small, but I feel like they're, especially young people, it feels like today, are making more connections between environmental issues and social justice and animal justice. I'm also quite happy to see that there's more conversations about food sovereignty within public discourse. And then people are talking about decolonization and people's relationships with the land and Indigenous people's relationships with the land. So those deeper sets of conversations, as opposed to just how do we tweak the system to make it more humane, I feel like some of those decolonial conversations actually lend themselves to thinking about animal liberation in a deeper way that brings in that structural analysis.
In your article, you draw attention to slaughterhouses as a site of human as well as animal exploitation, oppression, and suffering. And Lauren, I know that in your radio show, you interviewed many slaughterhouse workers. It might initially surprise some people that as animal advocates, you're concerned about the situation of the people who are killing the animals, but you demonstrate that the situation is much more complex than that. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the possibility of coalitions between labor and animal advocacy movements. And this is something, as you know, Dinesh Wadawal has been working on. And in one of his pieces, he notes that slaughterhouses have never stopped because of the activism of animal advocates, but they have come to a halt due to the activism of the labor movement. So in particular, slaughterhouses stopped during general strikes in some European countries, primarily because the veterinarians were not working. So they weren't saying, yeah, this meat is safe or these animals are safe to be killed for food. So the slaughterhouses had to stop, and at points the countries were running out of meat. And I remember Kentucky Fried Chicken closed in some European countries. So that implies that labor animal advocacy coalitions are not only necessary for the reasons that you're describing in your article, but might also be the most effective way for animal advocates to meet their goals. It's also interesting to me, and I don't know if you have any thoughts on this, about that it was the vets striking and the general strike that resulted in the shuts of the slaughterhouses, not the meatpacking employees. And so I wondered if you had what the implications of that are, what the reasons were, and any of your thoughts on the above.
It is a challenging question, and I think the topic itself is challenging, this idea of coalitions and solidarity between labor and animal advocacy. Okay, I'm going to be a lot less pessimistic for this one. When we think about how we can work in a way, and we as in the animal advocacy movement in this case, work in a way that would create a condition, an outcome that is beneficial to slaughterhouse workers and animals and the environment, it might not be necessary that we work directly with veterinarians or slaughterhouse workers, even though if those relationships could be built, it would probably make our work more effective in many different ways. So I think those efforts are still very worthwhile and important. But here I'm thinking about how temporary, and I think Lauren, you used the word ephemeral, just like how, how short-term these kind of results actually are. They're not sustained to a point where we actually see economic impact on the animal agriculture industry when these things do happen, when slaughterhouse workers go on strike or veterinarians go on strike, or call for meat boycotts and stuff like that. So I think ultimately what still needs to happen is we need to think more in terms of transformative justice. And a really good example of this is something like the Green New Deal, which has been gaining a lot of traction over the past couple of years, thanks to politicians like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the US and north of the border here. The NDP have been pushing it a little bit, but kind of hesitant in many ways. So I think, leading up to COVID and even past COVID, when Green New Deal is kind of a big part of the political conversation, I did see quite a few animal advocates kind of question on social media, kind of asking like, where are all the animal rights activists in this conversation, right? Like, why aren't we trying to get the issue of animal agriculture, animal farming into something like the Green New Deal? And so I think that is one area where there's a lot of potential when we think about creating jobs that are actually good for the workers, for the environment, jobs that are based on care, based on restoring wild habitats and wild animal habitats and land restoration, forest restoration, rewilding, that kind of stuff. I think that is perhaps one example in which we could go through this alternative political route or do political campaigns, advocacy campaigns targeting the corporations directly without having to directly engage with slaughterhouse workers and kind of try to get them to create more what Dr. Kendra Coulter would call humane jobs. So jobs that are good for humans, animals, and the environment, and approach it. And I think generally transformative justice has been a really good frame to do our activism. And I think we've seen this over the summer as well. I think, Lauren, you might want to talk a little bit about this as well, because while we were writing this article, we saw the Black Lives Matter protests and uprisings across the US and actually across the world internationally. And a lot of what they were calling for and demanding is defunding and abolishing police and prisons, right? So it created this moment where we kind of got straight to some of the deeper sort of roots of the problem, the systemic and institutional issues, and not just kind of like surface level racism, and really kind of talking about how prisons and the police are racist colonial institutions that are inherently reproducing a lot of violence against Black and Indigenous communities. I am reminded by this question, though, that a few years ago at a conference, Lauren Ornelas, who's the founder of Food Empowerment Project, she may have changed her position on this years later, but I remember really clearly that she said, on Food Empowerment Project's website, you're not going to find them saying that they are in solidarity with slaughterhouse workers. And I think she said it's because it's important for them as a vegan animal advocacy and food justice organization to acknowledge that there is, in fact, a conflict of interest, at least in the short term, between their mission and the slaughterhouse workers' jobs, right? So, while they stand in solidarity with farm workers who are growing produce, they can't really say they're in solidarity with slaughterhouse workers. But that doesn't mean their work doesn't really impact, and I would say it does impact the kind of more long-term future of possibilities of what kinds of jobs could be created if industries shift. So I think ultimately that's where animal advocates could work more at that level, is to continue to fight for ununionized workers to get unionized, fighting for better working conditions and wages. But ultimately we need to see industries transform.
I guess I'll just very quickly add that I think that the animal movements really need to pay homage to the many workers who have been whistleblowers over the years and about conditions in the plants. And that one of the things that I take from Karl Orzechowski's film Maximum Tolerated Dose is that there needs to be a space for workers to feel that they can come forward, and that the animal movements will not vilify them. And they offer a longitudinal understanding of the conditions and how they're changing. And some of the earlier work in the animal movements was because people were filming and documenting those conditions. And so I think that we can talk about potential solidarities, but I think that we've already seen that in some cases, those whistleblowers have provided crucial information to the animal movements. And I feel that we have a responsibility to at least create some sort of safe space where people can share their stories. People like Virgil Butler did this, and he became a major spokesperson for what we would consider more welfarist measures. But I think that slaughterhouse workers have an important voice to contribute to an understanding of the current agricultural system. So I just wanted to add that additional piece on there.
Do either of you, just in the last minute or so that we have left, want to say anything about in vitro meat? Do you see this as in any way a solution to any of the issues that you've been talking about?
I like the idea of in vitro meat. I know there are a lot of existing critiques about whether it's actually going to be significantly more sustainable environmentally. Critical animal studies scholars, a lot of them have critiqued whether this would just kind of reproduce and reinforce the idea that just generally in terms of harm reduction and minimizing harm, it's good to see this happen. And I highly recommend anyone listening to this to check out the documentary Meat the Future by Liz Marshall. The documentary really shows what in vitro meat production could look like by following people in the industry.
I guess I just wanted to quickly say I agree with Darren wholeheartedly on the previous question as well, that it's really hopefully what we need to have is more conversations and more actions around restructuring the food system in general. So about in vitro meat, I think that it's exciting, the idea that there could be such a large scale minimization of the suffering involved. But I'm also compelled by arguments where ultimately this is still going to be based in animal experimentation, animal use. And I think that that is an interesting place where our philosophy about animal rights and liberation and the non-property status of animals in particular, kind of, what is it, the rubber hits the road. Like, this is where I think that the animal movements need to have some hard conversations about not necessarily purity, but about whether or not we could see these maybe as a transitional step towards something that doesn't include exploiting animal bodies as property. Maybe this could be a bridge. That would make me a heretic by some vegan abolitionists.